So first, I'd just like to let you know I am your host, Michelle Presnell, and I'm the Associate Director of Development in the Office of Institutional Advancement here at CHC. Helping us out this evening is my colleague from the Office of Institutional Advancement, Steph Reif. She is the Associate Director of Advancement Events and herself a graduate, class of 2013.
Oh, 13, good.
So we have quite a few attendees, like I said, and we want to make sure everyone's comfortable and gets a chance to ask questions. Our format this evening, we're going to have Dr. Contasta and Dr. Meyer talk a little bit. You'll see a presentation. It'll be about half an hour, and then we'll leave some time for questions at the end. So we do appreciate it if you hold all your questions till the end of the presentation when we do question and answer time. So right now, I'd like to turn it over to Steph, who has a few housekeeping rules and tech options so that we can all have a great experience. Steph?
Thank you, Michelle. Hello, everyone. So I have a few tips to maximize our experience tonight. At this time, I ask that everybody please mute yourself. I can also do this on my end, but it's easier if you mute yourselves. And that's just so we can avoid some background noise, some distractions. So I'll give everybody a moment to do that. Wow, everybody's so fast. Thank you. We recommend that you use the speaker view tonight. So the speaker view setting, if you're on a laptop or a computer, can be found at the top right corner. It's a little box that says speaker view. If you can only see me and a few other people at the top right now, you're already in it. If you're on an iPad or a tablet, you'll have to swipe left and right until you find just me talking. Hopefully everybody's there. We ask that you please limit moving your device during the presentation as it can be distracting. If you have any questions that you can't wait till the end, you just have to type them out so you don't forget, you can use the chat feature. The chat feature is at the bottom in the center. If you click on it, a little window will pop up on the right side of your screen and you can type the questions in then. And I think that's everything. Back to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Steph. I really appreciate your help with us tonight. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers, and I think most of you know them quite well. First, we have Dr. David Contasta, Professor of History. He's been teaching American history at CHC for many years, as most of you know. He's the author of over 20 books, including books on regional topics such as Suburb in the City, Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia, and Metropolitan Paradise, Philadelphia's Wissahickon Valley, which some of you may remember from our May Zoom chat that we did. At present, he is writing a book about the US presidency entitled American Monarchy. Dr. Contasta has lectured at Nanjing University in China and Pyeongtaek University in South Korea. He is the recipient of the Lindbach Award for Distinguished Teaching. Welcome, Dr. Contasta.
Thank you, Michelle.
Also with us tonight is Dr. Bob Meyer. Dr. Meyer, professor of biology, arrived at CHC in 1982. Over the course of his tenure, he grew the biology department at CHC to include summer internship in environmental science. Dr. Meyer has also won the Lindbach Award for Distinguished Teaching. However, this past spring, as you know, he retired from CHC, but was granted the title of Professor Emeritus by the college. So we will continue to bother him for things like this.
Oh boy.
Thank you for being here. And you can read more about Dr. Meyer in this month, in the summer issue, of CHC's magazine. And if you didn't receive, I know you can't see it when I hold it up, but if you didn't receive it, Steph is going to send you a link through the chat function now, where you can see it online if you like.
Yeah.
How's that, Steph? Did that happen?
Yes, thanks, Michelle.
Wonderful. Great. So Dr. Contasta and Dr. Meyer have created a short presentation. And like I said, it'll take about 20, 25 minutes, somewhere around there, and then we will have questions. So without further ado, I will start the presentation.
The title's called Climate Change, Some Hopeful Trends. And so we're not exactly, David and I were hoping not to spend an awful lot of time on the negatives, of which there are many, but try and point out some of the more things we can sort of grasp onto with a little hope about climate change and global warming. Now, I'm going to give you just a very, very short background on global warming and how it applies to climate change. When I was in high school, we were taught this global process called the greenhouse effect. which is a fairly simple idea that visible light gets through the atmosphere as if it was transparent, hits the Earth, warms it up, and the Earth, like any object that is heated up, starts radiating infrared light. Now, infrared light, on the other hand, doesn't consider the atmosphere invisible. In fact, it gets absorbed by the atmosphere. We know now that the carbon dioxide and other gases absorb that energy and then emit it again, some of it back down to the Earth. So it acts like you can think of it as sort of a partial mirror. Some of the energy gets out, but some of it gets rerouted right back to the Earth again. If you fast forward to when I was started teaching, we started talking more about my students about how this is a possibility of causing global warming. That if we continually increase the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're going to increase the capability of the atmosphere for reflecting that heat back down again. And that this will slowly start to warm the Earth, and there could be consequences to that. Fast forward again to now, where global warming and climate change are in the news. I didn't see that when I was in high school. I didn't see this on the TV, or I didn't hear it, read it in the magazines. Now we hear about global warming all the time. How it links to climate change is sort of easy to understand too. If you watch your weather stations, you know that like the two hurricanes that are barreling down towards Texas right now, especially Hurricane Laura, feed themselves from the heat energy in the ocean. And as the ocean gets warmer and warmer and warmer with global warming, that energy, more and more energy is available to those kinds of storms, so that those storms may become more frequent, may become more powerful because of that heat energy that's in the ocean. So large hurricanes, typhoons, that kind of thing, we might expect to get more prevalent and more more powerful. Also, we have the Earth is not heating up evenly. The poles are actually heating faster than the equator is. And this is throwing off the jet stream. Now, the jet stream is sort of an upper atmosphere barrier that keeps the cold of the north separated from the warmer air of the south. And when we go through our seasons, like when we're going into fall now and into winter, the jet stream will drop down and we'll get cold weather. During the summer, the jet stream is north of us, and we get hot weather. That's how it essentially is supposed to work. And in those transitional seasons, sometimes the jet stream goes back and forth over us, and we get a more variable kind of weather in the transitional seasons. The problem is that the polar vortex weakens when the poles heat up too much. And when it weakens, it starts to make huge bends and curves like this, so that we might see a band of hot weather go across us, then a band of cold weather, then a band of hot, then a band of cold. And sometimes those bands get stuck in one place. California out west, they've had a terrible time with droughts in the past several years because they get stuck under a band of hot weather. And that extends all the way up to Alaska. Alaska is being severely impacted by hot weather. They're not getting the snowfall they used to get. They're not getting the snowpack they used to get. And here where we live, we might end up with a very cold winter, or like last year where we didn't have much of a winter at all. It depends on those wobbly bands of air that are going across us. So those wobbles, that variability also is capable of increasing with global warming. And just to throw a third one in there, temperature zones. The temperature zones on the planet are moving northwards. As the equator gets warmer, it's pushing those up there. If you're a horticulturalist, if you do gardening, you know that certain plants do well in certain temperature zones. Those temperature zones are moving northward. Hotter ones are coming up from the south, and ones we used to live in are making their way north. That changes all sorts of environmental habitat situations and a lot of environmental problems because some plants and animals have to move if they want to stay in their comfort zone. Now, a lot of animals can move. Plants have a lot harder time doing that. And if things go the way they've been going, there have been estimates that I've seen that by 2050, if you want to see a sugar maple or an aspen, you're going to have to go to Maine or Canada because there aren't going to be any down this far anymore. So that's sort of the situation we're in right now. It appears as if this is going to keep increasing. And it's not certain what the ultimate kinds of impacts are going to be if it does increase.
Bob, I'm curious to know when the first person may have said something about the possibility of global warming. Was this just a few decades ago, or does it go back quite a ways?
Now, it goes all the way back to the end of the 19th century, really close to the end. There were a couple of people that sort of got onto the idea that carbon dioxide levels can cause warming in the atmosphere. But the guy that really laid it down in a paper was a guy called Thomas Chamberlain in 1899, so right just before the turn of the century. And he made a prediction that increased injection of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would cause a constant global warming.
Why didn't anybody pay any attention to it? Why did it take decades before anybody heeded that warning?
Well, some of those reasons are the same reasons we have trouble today. At that period, there were no obvious effects. In 1899, people were seeing these kinds of weather events, for instance, or these climate changing events. There was also a very low level of monitoring technology. We couldn't get global temperatures that you could rely on very well because we simply didn't have the technology to do that kind of thing. CO2 sources were fewer back then too, so the increase was not egregious. And lots of people argued that, oh, the oceans will absorb any excess CO2. The trees will absorb any excess CO2. So it wasn't until much later where we actually start to see some effects that people started to sit up and take notice. And part of the problem we have now today even is that it's very difficult to point to a particular event and say that's caused by global warming. We have to talk about things like frequency of hurricanes and how strong they are and how this is going to happen more often. But if you point to something, you can't say, there's global warming, because you see what the climate deniers do all the time. They'll get a particularly cold winter. Where's the global warming? Look how cold it was this winter. All right. So that's why we've kind of moved to the term climate change and stay away from global warming. Though, in fact, global warming is what triggers most of these climate changes. David's going to talk a little bit about industrialization as a cause of climate change.
And I think Chamberlain was very much aware of the fact that industrialization would be driving climate change. The Industrial Revolution begins in the mid-1700s in the British Isles, and it's powered largely by steam engines. They're high-powered steam engines. They're fired by coal. That is, they use fossil fuels. And this industrialization is going to spread all over the world, or at least all over Europe and into North America and ultimately into Asia and so forth. And this steam engine that's powered by coal is going to replace water power, wind power, and muscle power. We can think of the Wissahickon Valley, for example. There were about 25 mills along the creek between the Schuylkill and Chestnut Hill College. But when coal begins to come down the canal, we call it the Manayunk Canal now, those steam-powered, coal-powered mills in Manayunk are going to undermine and destroy the water-powered mills along the Wissahickon. These steam engines are also used to power steamboats and steamships that are going back and forth across the Atlantic and the Pacific. And perhaps most importantly, they're going to be powering railroad locomotives. And by the way, the first railroads appear in Great Britain almost 200 years ago in the 1820s. And we're going to have the 200th anniversary of railroading here in the 2030s. At the end of the 19th century, we have the appearance of electricity, of electric lighting, and electricity is being used to run engines of one kind or another. And you might think that that's a clean form of energy, except that almost all of the electricity was generated by coal-fired processes.
David,
You also, yeah.
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You're not done.
No, go ahead. This is a good question. Ask a question, Bob.
Yeah. The United States only has about 4% of the world's population, and yet we are among the highest emitters of carbon dioxide. So how does that jive? What is it about, you know, our local situation here in the United States that puts us in that category?
Well, there are a lot of reasons for it. We were blessed with an abundance of natural resources. And if we just want to talk about the local area, Pennsylvania has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of coal left, and that was used to power the industries here. And I was going to say a little bit later on, we think that unless the GDP increases by 3 or 4 or 5% every year, the country has failed. And politicians are going to be measured by that, and presidents are going to be criticized for it. This is unsustainable in the long run. We also insist that one generation is wealthier than the generation before. And the reason we're more of a threat is that an American baby is going to consume maybe 1,000 times as much in way of goods and services, maybe 100 times probably as much as goods and services as someone born in an impoverished country. So that's the reason we are only 4% of the population. I wanted to go on just a little bit beyond electricity. We have the internal combustion engine that makes its appearance in the 1880s. It's largely the Germans and the French who create the first automobiles. Henry Ford didn't invent the car. We all thought that when we were growing up. But Ford, of course, produces a very cheap model in 1913, and by the 1920s, automobile ownership has exploded. And it's only about 20 years after cars appear for the first time that the Wright brothers used the internal combustion engine to fly. And so we have aircraft and propeller-driven aircraft and jet aircraft, and they're all burning petroleum products and, of course, spewing out all kinds of CO2. So it begins with the Industrial Revolution and continues with other kinds of engines that are using fossil fuels. And so, we flip to the next slide, and Bob can talk about another driver of climate change.
Okay. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody since all of these industrial impacts that David's talking about are based on human needs. And the more of us there are, the greater those needs are going to be. Our demand for electricity, our demand for gasoline, our demand for power in general increases as the population increases. Now, right now, I checked this morning, we're at about 7.8 billion. When I was born, it was less than 3. So that gives you an idea how fast we are going up. It took all of human history to get to 1800, where we had 1 billion. It took 130 years to get the next billion, 30 years to get the next billion, 15 to get the next billion. And then we settled into a kind of a steady 1 billion every 12 years. And that puts us where we are. By 2023, we'll hit 8. Now, that sounds terrible because it's, that increase in population is going to drive all of this demand for power and electricity and things like that. There is some good news, though, and that is that the rate of increase has been dropping since the 1960s. Right? We were going out at almost an asymptotic level. In fact, you would have expected those numbers I quoted you to start dropping even below 12, but they didn't. They stopped at 12, and we sort of plateaued out. And at least the UN expectation is that the next billion will take 14 years, and the next billion after that will take 20. Now, I don't think we're going to, no, there's going to be a stoppage point at some point. Because the rate of increase has been slowing down since the 60s. And one of the reasons, well, there's a whole lot of reasons, and actually, I I kind of wanted to tell you some of the reasons we got into the problem we're in, is that we simply stopped dying. It's not like people are having more babies. We're having the same amount of babies. It's just that we don't die anymore. The advent of good nutrition, vaccines, antibiotics, and importantly, and something that people don't look at hard enough, is public sanitation had a huge impact on lifespan. And as our lifespans increased, the population increased. We were used to be in an agrarian economy where having a ton of kids was a good idea, A, because a lot of them weren't going to stay alive, and B, you needed all those extra hands to help. When we moved to an industrial economy, babies in an industrial economy are expensive. Babies in an agrarian economy are cheap and necessary. So as the world's countries develop, it becomes less and less necessary to have lots and lots of kids, and it becomes expensive to have lots and lots of kids. So urbanization is one of the things that's slowing us down. World fertility rates right now are, let's see, what is it right now? It's about 2.4 to 2.5. If you get below 2.1, the population starts to go down. So we've slowed considerably. That's called the replacement rate. Every couple has 2.1 kids. That's a steady state. And you may say, why 2.1? Well, because some babies always die. You always have some infant mortality. Today, China is at 1.5. They've really taken themselves in hand as far as population goes. Brazil's at 1.8. We right now are right on the borderline. If you looked at births and deaths only, we would be below 2.1. But we still have a lot of what fuels the U.S.'s population is immigration. We take a lot of people in, and that kind of keeps us on an even keel. We've been about at 330 million, give or take, for a while now, and it's steady because of immigrants. But it's not because people are having we are having less babies also. The University of Washington thinks that by 2100 it'll be 1.7 worldwide, and the population will be dropping. Now you can get population numbers from a lot of different places, a lot of different estimates, different models. I've seen a model that says we won't even get to 8 billion by 2040. Well, that's obviously not going to happen. So that one's off the picture. There was a study in The Lancet, which is a medical journal, that they estimated 9.7 billion by 2064 before it starts dropping off. The UN is predicting 10.9 by 2100 before it starts to drop off. I think it's going to drop off faster than that, but I don't think we're going to make we're going to stop at 8 billion in 2040. So urbanization is important. The decline in infant mortality. There's no longer a need to have so many children, so people don't. But the one that's the best predictor is how developed a country becomes and how much it educates and frees its women. As the education of women increases in a country, the birth rate drops. Because women are interested in careers, they're interested in their own lives. They're not just making babies as part of their social contract. So the women's movement, women's education, women's career opportunities, these are slowing down the birth rate. There's improved access to birth control worldwide. And we are slowly overcoming cultural barriers to that. More social services to support the elderly. If you have more social services, you don't need to have 1 million kids to take care of you when you're old because you've got social services. There's even some ideas that are a little stranger and off to the side. I've talked with my students a lot about the finding of microplastics in everything. There's microplastics in our water. There's microplastics in our food. Some people have suggested that as microplastics break down in your body, they release molecules, breakdown products that mimic sex hormones and actually decrease fertility. Now that, don't go off and tell that to your friends and neighbors. That's very much a theory at this stage of the game. David and I read an article with our students last semester about the sex recession. There seems to be an increasing disinterest in having a sexual relation or needing a sexual relation among young men and women. The reasons for that I don't even want to get into, because there's multiple possible reasons for that, and all of them are suppositions at this stage of the game. So the point, the hopeful bit, is that the population is declining. The question is it declining fast enough? Okay. You can't keep going at the rate we've been going. You can't support that many people on this planet. We will strip the planet bare eventually. So we have to start going down again.
One thing we talked
go
about
ahead.
in the seminar was the Malthusian trap. Do you want to say just a few words about that? Because I think that's really helpful. The Malthusian trap.
Malthus was very interested in the problem of increasing populations. David, you have the dates for Malthus?
Yeah, 1798, he writes an essay on population, and he was an Anglican priest. They called him Parson Malthus. And he realized that populations were doubling every 20 or 25 years. We think he was influenced by Benjamin Franklin, who talked about how the population in the English colonies was doubling about every 20 years. And it also was increasing in Ireland because the potato was available. And so Malthus was concerned that the population was growing geometrically, but that the food supply was growing arithmetically, and people were going to starve to death. And he said,
Malthus thought we'd hit a barrier way before we did.
Before.
He thought
that several things would stop it. That is, we'd starve to death. There would be disease, wars, and he thought that one hope would be moral restraint, that is, people would restrain themselves, and maybe that would cut the population. So,
yeah, I mean, he wasn't really reckoning on our increases in medical technology and our increases in agricultural technology, especially. Right. We've managed to feed the world relatively, clearly there are many, many people who don't get enough food, but in general, he expected us to hit that barrier very, very long ago, because he was only using the agricultural technology that he could see at the time. We've increased that technology exponentially also. And so far we've kept track, but you can't keep track forever. There's only so much arable land on the planet. There's only so much food we can make. Sooner or later, we're going to hit a dead end, a barrier. But if this drop off of population continues, we might survive crashing the population, which would be horrendous. But
the more food one produces, the more children people tend to have, because they're healthier, and it's possible to support a larger population. It becomes a kind of a vicious cycle in a way, which I think is the trap.
Yeah, especially in the old days. Now it's a little, we got plenty of food, but little buggers are just so expensive. It's hard to, I can't imagine having, 9 or 10 kids. I just can't even imagine that.
If you had a farm, though, it might be helpful, right, Bob?
Yeah. But if you had a wife who wanted to have a career, you wouldn't have 9 or 10 kids. Yeah, David's going to talk a little bit about the causes and consequences of suburban sprawl.
This is a perfect suburban photograph with a huge mall with hundreds of cars parked around it. And I think we've all experienced this. We've driven by them. Malls may be dying finally, but that's another story altogether. Suburban sprawl is a real threat, and it's one of the causes of climate change. And automobiles, of course, made it possible. There were railroad suburbs at the end of the 19th century, but you can't make the train line, the tracks curve so that you can build houses all over the place. Once cars come in, though, roads are a lot cheaper to make, and in fact, you might find an old farm road someplace. And anywhere the car can go, then developers, of course, can begin to put up houses. So the automobile is one of the culprits here, and people spreading out all over the place. I'll just talk about Philadelphia very briefly here. The population of southeastern Pennsylvania, greater Philadelphia, hasn't grown at all in the last 30 or 35 years, but the same number of people have spread out over more and more land, over more and more territory. So you can't argue that all this building had to be done because the population locally was increasing. It hasn't been. And so I think that's a working definition of sprawl. There's also a governmental aspect of this. The Veterans Administration, when they were lending money to build new houses after World War II and then well beyond that, engaged in redlining. Part of it was racial redlining, but they also didn't want to lend money for GIs to buy older houses in the city because they figured if they had to repossess them, then they might not be worth as much as a brand new house in Levittown, let's say, or in some other community. The FHA did the same thing. So the government's encouraging new houses in the suburbs. And then there's lobbying for roads rather than railroads. The oil companies, the bulldozer companies, the car companies lobby heavily against the building of public transportations. They lobby in Harrisburg, they lobby in Washington, and so on. In fact, General Motors would go into towns and cities and say, we'll sell you some new buses really cheaply, and we'll tear up the trolley tracks for you while we're at it. Well, of course, they didn't want the trolleys to come back. So there's a real disinvestment in public transportation in this country in the post-World War II period. We've lagged behind most of the rest of the advanced world. You can take trains in Japan that go 200 miles an hour. Chinese have them. Many European countries have them. Our train system is a joke in comparison to the rest of the world. And so people don't take it because it's not that fast and it's not that efficient. And part of the reason that legislators were willing to cater to the car is that people who had cars tended to have more money, and legislators are going to listen to people who have more money instead of people who maybe ride the bus or take public transportation. Zoning is also a culprit, interestingly enough. Zoning comes into being in the 1920s and in the 1930s. And because of zoning, it's illegal to have mixed uses of all sorts. Chestnut Hill, the main street in Chestnut Hill would be illegal now. You cannot have shops with apartments above them. You can't have a mixture of residential and commercial. And in the typical suburban area, you have these separate pods. You have residential pods, you have an educational pod, you have the mall pod, and so forth. Children can't walk to school because they take their life in their hands if they did. And often these mega high schools are too far away for anybody to walk there. So that gets me to talking about the walking town and the walking city. Towns and cities were designed on a walking scale. If you take the train to Chestnut Hill East downtown, you'll go through a lot of abandoned factories, but you'll notice that the workers lived nearby. They lived in those row houses. They could hear the whistle blowing and so forth. Even wealthy people in the 19th century didn't want to have to hitch up a horse to go to work. They wanted to live within walking distance of work. Until fairly recently then, people walked to work, they walked to school, they walked to church, they walked to shop. All this was destroyed in suburban communities. One has to literally drive everywhere and drive the kids everywhere, drive them to this lesson and that lesson and the other lesson, to school and so forth and so on. So the destruction of the walking scale is one of the culprits. We're having to use cars and burn fossil fuels in order to propel them. We also have fragmented land use, and that's another problem too. There are 2,500 municipalities in Pennsylvania. A lot of them are townships, and they don't have to cooperate with each other in land use planning. So they all do what they want to do. So there's no possibility of getting together and saying, maybe this would be a better idea, maybe there could be greater efficiencies and so forth. Bob, I think you have a question.
Yeah, did it have to go this way? I mean, were there alternatives that could have been tried, or is there a way out of this now?
I don't know whether there's a way out of it, but planners in the late 1800s, again, about the same time that Chamberlain's talking about the possibility of warning, we're creating what they called garden cities. Ebenezer Howard's a good example in England. Letchworth Village is a good example. These garden cities were outside larger cities like London, let's say, and one could commute to the city by train. But the garden cities were not densely packed. The houses weren't extraordinarily close together, but they were surrounded by fields or forest, hence Garden City. And after World War II, the British government encouraged what they called new towns. The British, by the way, did not allow people to go out and buy farm fields miles and miles away from anything and put in developments. And the reason they didn't is because they don't have as much land as we do. And that's one of the problems here in the United States. People think, oh, we have all this land, it doesn't matter, we can pave over all this rich farmland. British and a lot of European countries don't have that land. It wouldn't allow it to be used. Bob and I talked about the conservation movement in other respects too. For a long time, there was the idea that we had inexhaustible resources here. We had natural resources that would last for hundreds and hundreds of years. We know that's not the case, but a lot of the development here is just extraordinarily wasteful. And so whether we can go back to that model or not, I don't know. There are some planned towns like Celebration in Florida, Seaside, also in Florida, where they've tried to go back to the old kind of town, and people tend to like that. They like to be able to walk. They like to have a downtown with their shops. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where we walked everywhere. I could walk to my grandmother's house, to my friend's house, my cousin's house, to the library, to the movies, and so forth. Suburbs are really terrible for teenagers because they don't have any autonomy. They have to wait for people to drive them around. So I don't know whether there's any solution or not, whether we can go back to some of these ideas or not. I think there's going to be a lot of resistance to it.
Yeah, it seems like we're so locked into this particular culture now, and so much of our infrastructure is bent around it. I'm not even sure how to proceed in fixing the problem.
It's an extraordinarily wasteful way to live, extraordinarily wasteful, and yet it becomes the American dream for many people.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about alternative energy sources. Clearly, the villain in this whole scenario is fossil fuels. We live in a fossil fuel economy. We have since they started pulling coal out of the ground. Fossil fuels are responsible for the vast bulk of carbon dioxide footprint on the planet. In the United States, I find this is kind of interesting. Transportation has just inched out power generation. 29% of our carbon footprint is for cars, trucks, trains, planes, transportation, and 28% is power generation. It didn't used to be that way. Industries in there with 23, and then it rapidly drops down after that. Agriculture's 9%. Commercial endeavors are 6.5. Residential, the kind of energy that you and I use, 5.2%. If you're going to make changes in our carbon footprint as a nation, and actually as a world, you're going to have to tackle the big three at the top. It's fine to get a Prius and feel like you're doing your bit, but you're only affecting that little 5% that is due for us. There are multiple alternative energy sources. Some of the obvious ones are things like wind and solar that we're all familiar with. Hydroelectric power, which has been with us for quite a while, mostly due to the construction of huge dams. Then there's some odd little ones like wave action and tide action, tidal power and wave power. You can actually harness the movement of waves and tides. As long as you have movement somewhere, you can turn that into electricity if you build the technology correctly. Geothermal is another one, tapping into the energy of the heat of the planet. We have biofuels. Instead of burning fossil fuels, you can burn organic material. And we have hydrogen cells that don't use organic material to burn, but simply take hydrogen and oxygen, put them together to make water, and it releases energy. Now, all of these things have pluses and all of these things have minuses. But what I wanted to point out was which of these is growing fastest. Right now, let me mention hydroelectricity first. It's not a fast grower. In the world, it's only in the 8 years or between 2010 and 2018, it only increased 1.2 times.
And it's
But
done
that's
terrible
because-
ecological damage, right, Bob? These dams
Yeah.
have been horrible.
Water quality decreases, it destroys habitats. And the reason it's not increasing is that all the good sites have been taken by this point. And a lot of dams and things are being taken down because of those very same ecological problems we've been having. Now, hydroelectricity is by far the most successful of the alternate energy. About 17% of electricity generation is from hydroelectric dams. But that's not going to go anywhere. That's not going to increase at this point. In fact, you might expect it eventually to start decreasing. The one that's moving the fastest is solar. In that same 8-year period, solar energy has generation of electricity has increased 17.6% in 8 years. Now that sounds great, but remember we started from very low levels and we're only moving our way up. Wind has increased about four times in that same period, but actually we generate more energy from wind worldwide than we do from solar at this point. But solar is fast and efficient and it's not so objectionable. A lot of people have trouble with wind generated power because it takes up, it's not aesthetically pleasing. You know, you see these big, I love them. I think they look great, but a lot of people do not. So finding places to set these things up is tricky. The others are barely there at all. That wind the tide and wave generation, that's a minuscule piece of generation right now. And actually not that many countries are even looking into that at this point. Geothermal does okay, but it's still, it's a large cost to start with. It has a large startup cost. So the big ones that we're putting are now you notice I haven't mentioned nuclear because that's not considered a renewable energy source. It certainly is a clean one. It certainly doesn't put CO2 into the atmosphere, and many countries in the world have put a lot of investment in nuclear energy. But it has that one nagging problem, which is what do you do with nuclear waste? And especially nuclear waste that isn't going to decay for thousands and thousands of years. That's a real issue with nuclear power. I don't think anybody sees nuclear power as an endpoint. But right now, at least it doesn't put CO2 into the atmosphere. Let's see, I wanted to do a little bit of comparison with some of the big, the major economies of the world. On a per capita basis, we generate about 13.4% of the carbon footprint of the world. Okay, Russia 4.9, Japan 2.7, China 24.3. China has passed us mostly because they've made some very rapid technological increases lately, and they have a huge population. Cumulatively, though, if you look at the period between 1751 and today, we've generated 25% of all the carbon we've ever put into the atmosphere, where China only is 13%, if you look at across that whole time period. But they're rapidly catching up. India, tons of people, but their technology is not exactly where ours is right now. They contribute about 6.3% of the world's carbon footprint, and their cumulative rate is only 3%. So the United States is right up there as far as CO2 generation. It's easy to point at the countries like China and India that have the huge populations. They have 4 times our population, each of them. In fact, they're both very similar right now, about 1.4 billion people in each country. But you got to remember that ecological impact is not just a matter of how many people you have. It's a matter of how many people and what their consumer level is, their consumption level is, and what their level of technology is. So that's why with us, with only, like I said, we mentioned before, only 4% of the world's population, we still make 13.4% of the carbon output. And 20 years ago, we'd have been much higher than that because China hadn't caught up to us in any way, shape, or form at that point.
Bob, would you like to say a word as we're closing down here about science denial and climate change denial, and how is that holding us back, and what is it?
Sure, I can do that. Science denial isn't anything different in many ways, from general denial. You'd think, and I was trained as a scientist, so for me, evidence-based argument has a lot of weight. But if you're arguing for policy or changes in policy, if you're arguing to change a culture, values have equal, if not more, impact or import in that argument than evidence does. So science denial is that how am I going to put this? You can shovel as much evidence as you want in front of some people, and it simply will not matter. I've even read articles that say we're even arguing wrong. By arguing with evidence and by arguing with facts, all you do is get people's backs up, and they go the other direction. We see science denial in this question of climate change. We see science denial in the anti-vaxxers. If we could pull Darwin out of his grave, he'd had plenty to say about science denial, all the way back when he was putting the theory of natural selection out there.
And there's a lot of denial about COVID too.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of science people don't care about it all. They wouldn't deny it all. Nobody worries about how electricity works. Nobody worries about how do you make an air conditioner. Those are great. Everybody loves those. We love electricity. We love air conditioning. We love heating. But when you get close to threatening people's values, they get their back up about that. We still have that same evolution argument that Darwin had. Still. And the reason we do is because it hits close to people. It hits close to about how they feel about what they are, what their self-image is. They don't care about quantum mechanics. The physicists have a happy day. They can do whatever they want, and everybody's happy as long as every now and then they toss something practical our way that makes people happy. But biology is tricky. Anything that makes us uncomfortable, anything that is expensive, anything that would decrease what we consider our level of living, those things get pushed back. And it doesn't matter how much science you put in front of people, they're going to get pushed back. And a lot of times that falls into biology's purview. Because biology is, after all, is the science of us, as well as the other living things. But it's the one science that is most personal to us, and it hits us. It hits home. Another problem I think with science denial is that it has been given a huge boost by information technology. Yeah. It used to be if you had a crazy idea, you had a crazy idea. And you were the town person with the crazy idea. Now you can find other people with the same crazy idea. In fact, you can accumulate a huge number of people with the same crazy idea, and all those people do is listen to each other, or listen to the the news they're given that fits with what with what they've been thinking, with what they want to hear. You've got compatriots now, and that solidifies. That's how anti-vaxxers. I mean. We're blue in the face about the anti-vaxxing. That was one stupid paper that has been since ripped to shreds, even by the author. The author has admitted he made up that information. You're never going to get anti-vaxxers off the table because they bolster each other in their arguments.
Bob, I think we had to let our audience ask us some questions at this point. What do you think?
That's right. Otherwise, I'll get too wound up.
I know you get wound up, and you should.
Yeah, all right, gotta stop. Okay, Michelle, let her rip.
Okay. All right. That was so wonderful and informative. Thank you so much to both of you. Now, I think we're going to open the floor to questions. So how we want you to do this is just, if you can use your raise your hand icon, I can call on you to ask a question, and then you can unmute yourself, and we can hopefully have an orderly discussion here. We just have a few minutes left, and we can go over time a little bit if you want to stick with us. Does anyone have a question right now? Hilton, you have a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, unmute yourself.
I don't see the raising hand here. Anyways, yeah, thank you for your talk. Definitely population growth is the most important factor, right? Like if you can control population growth, you can control climate change, right? And from the population ecology perspective, right? We don't know even human carrying capacity, right? Like when we're going to stabilize.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm worried. Are we really far away because we keep pushing with technology, right? You mentioned all these alternative sources of energy that we can keep pushing the boundaries, right? Do you really think that we're gonna be able to get to a point before we reach the carrying capacity? I know that's like it's a tricky question.
I know. I mean, that's my hope, Hilton. I'm hoping these cultural reasons for slowing the population will kick in before we hit that point. Because it could be an absolute disaster. We could be having food wars. We could be having water wars. We're gonna have water wars anyway. I mean, we're already heating the planet up enough that areas are turning into deserts that didn't used to be deserts. We're going to have huge amounts of refugees and immigrants moving out of areas that are unlivable anymore. And they're going to want to move somewhere. You know. Yeah, my hope is yes. No, that's about as best I can do for you.
Yeah, I hope so too. Because when you see like African countries like Nigeria, probably that's what's going to happen. The population is going to explode, and then what?
Hilton's right. Everybody keep your eye on Nigeria. That's going to be the next India. They are going nuts over there. They're increasing their technology and their population at the same time. What's the big city, Hilton, in Nigeria? It starts with an L.
Lagos.
Uh-huh. Lagos is going to be the most populous city on the planet sooner than we think. And it's sort of under the radar. Nobody worries about Nigeria, but their population is exploding. Yeah, you're right about that. So I don't know if I have a lot of good things to keep so you can sleep tonight, but
yeah, that's the best way you can do, right?
Yeah.
Bob, I have a quick comment here. One of the hopeful things I heard you say was that by educating women
Yes.
are making their paths and having fewer babies. So I'm going to make a direct line from the education of women is helping slow climate change. Does that sound right?
In a way, I think so. I mean, you know, it's got a few steps in there,
Nice.
but one of the best indicators of population dynamics is how women are treated in the culture. A best predictor, I should say, of what the population is going to do is the education and the opportunities that you give women. That's been seen in many countries already that are starting to move from the third world into the developed status. Because women just don't want to be baby factories. You know, they want to have lives. They want to get educated. They want to have careers. I mean, you know, I in a lot of ways, I think even the drop off in fertility and that sex recession I mentioned is part of that. Yeah, it's not considered in many places. It gets less. It's less and less considered a cultural necessity to have children. People are starting to worry about taking care of themselves and their own lives.
Right.
Now you can look at that. You can look at that on if you think that's a bad thing or if you think that's a good thing. I think personally it's a good thing. Population decrease though has its problems. The smaller the populations are behind you, the less they're going to be able to support the larger old people population that's up in front of them.
Japan and China are seeing that right now,
Yeah.
big time.
They don't have enough people putting money into the system for the old population they've got.
Right.
I think
We'll have that problem too.
thank you. I think we might have time for one or maybe two more questions. I see Mary Helen would you like to ask a question.
Yes, I just wondered, what role do you see religion playing in what you've discussed?
Well,
I'll tell you. Well, I'll let me go and then I'll let David try a shot at it. I'll tell you one thing that I think a good role is. I remember when I was making that argument at science denial. Religion is another avenue for sort of enhancing the behaviors we want. That isn't necessarily you can't just push it away and say, oh, well, there's a science agenda there. You've got an agenda. I think a religious approach to, say, care for the earth, for instance, that doesn't necessarily depend on having to convince. You don't have to convince people with numbers. You don't have to convince people, but you can convince people with theology. I think so. I think a religious approach married with a scientific information could be a really powerful a way to go.
yeah, I would just embroider that a little bit. There's, of course, the Genesis charge that we should be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And human beings are given control over all the plants and the animals God has given them for us to use. And that established, I think, a kind of a hubris that we're different, not just in degree, but in kind from the rest of creation. And that's why a lot of people had trouble with Darwin.
Yeah.
So we can use the world in any way they want to. But I think, yes, if we are the lords of creation, then perhaps you can emphasize the stewardship idea. I don't think we are the lords of creation. I think we need to be humbler about where we are with the rest of creation. But maybe Bob has something there, the stewardship idea.
Yeah, stewardship. I once got into an argument with somebody about stewardship. Stewardship is I think is a fine idea. I mean, the human race has clearly got the most power to manipulate the environment.
Mhm.
It is therefore becomes our responsibility to think about how we. But buried under the good parts of stewardship is the idea that David's still talking about, is that we are still somehow separate, that we're taking care of it over here instead of being part of it. I think when we move more towards the idea of accepting that we are an integral piece of the whole thing,
Yes.
you make some steps forward. So I think in the short run, stewardship is probably an okay way to get people to do some good things. But I think ultimately we want to move to that more integrative piece where we're not the lords of creation. We're part of the creation.
And we're all dependent.
Yes.
All living
Yeah.
things.
I mean,
are
the
dependent
main
on
tenets
one
of
another.
ecology is that every piece depends on every other piece.
Everything's connected. Yes.
Very nice. I think we
Thank you.
have one more quick question and then we'll wrap up. Does anyone else have a question out there?
I was just joking with Bob that there were people in Europe that were protesting the Hadron Collider at CERN because they thought it could open a black hole in Europe and invert our universe. So I was going to say, being a physicist doesn't always get you off the hook from people criticizing you.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
And some people are saying that 5G internet is causing COVID.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and I remember when they I don't remember. Sorry, I wasn't born then. But when they first tested the atomic bomb, some people were afraid it was going to actually set the atmosphere on fire,
right.
and they did it anyway. So,
Okay. Do we have any last questions before we sign off? Anyone at all? raise your hand. Joseph Roach.
I thought the presentations were excellent. Thank you very much. I learned a lot from it. It was really,
Thanks, Joe.
yeah. I was thinking of the value part in like the, what you were talking about at the end and what people believe and they did get their backs up about. And they do value health. And you're seeing more and more in this current situation with people where there's walking trails and bikes and people are getting out of the house when they're not working from home. So they value of health and outdoors and stuff like that. And even the convenience of not driving their car everywhere, but having an Amazon truck or whatever deliver things.
Right.
So and the transportation thing that you mentioned before, one of the big rocks there, it may be a solution down the road if, as the transportation folks like Amazon provide that service and make that profit, that they somehow contribute back. Maybe they have to pay a transportation tax or something like that, incentivize them to become more efficient where there's less trips or less trucks or doing it more efficiently. And then you really are getting the big issue of transportation and you're getting people not to drive as much because they're having stuff delivered right to their homes.
Well, they say they're going to have all these trucks that are going to be kind. And of course, we noticed when everything was shut down how clear the air was. And I think that gave us a sense of where we could be. And Bob talked about this, but I think the solution is electric vehicles, but the electricity cannot be generated by fossil fuels. It has to be generated by renewables. So there's a connection between the two of them, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think eventually we're going to see electric vehicles. And they're going to be everywhere. But David's right. It all depends where you get that electricity from. And Joe, what you're talking about, I agree. But that takes a kind of political will. That takes policy change. For a long time, people have been sort of dumping the responsibility for the environment on the individual. Mm-hmm. You know, you need to recycle. You need to get an energy efficient car. You need to do this. You need to do that. But nothing's really going to change until things change from a political standpoint. Until we have the political will to make changes that affect the entire country at the same time. It's really, I think in many ways, it's unfair to put that burden on the individual. And yet that's kind of David and I talk, that's kind of a common theme in a lot of environmental issues is, you know, let's dump it on the individual, you know.
It's going to be hard to get these.
You're not recycling, you know.
It's going to be hard to get this political change because all the lobbyists are just going to dump billions of dollars into fighting against all these changes.
It's going to take
the European oil companies, we saw this in the New York Times last week, are beginning to move away from fossil fuels to renewables. They're doing a much better job than we are because they have more powerful central governments than we do. Federalism's a wonderful thing sometimes, but it's also horrendous when it comes to a virus and to a lot of these other issues.
In this country, it's going to take one crisis after another before we push people into that mindset. And the trouble is, by then it could be too late.
It could be too late. It's really in our culture. We started out as rebels against governments, rebels against established churches. We came here, no one was going to tell us what to do by God.
Yeah, still that way.
It's still that way.
Okay.
No one's going to make me wear a mask, by God.
All right.
I'll be moving to Canada.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Catasta and Dr. Meyer, and all of our attendees. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know we ran a little bit over time, but it's such an important topic and so relevant to all of our lives. So thank you very much for your participation, and stay tuned for more talks like this. We hope you join us in the future.
Thank you, Michelle, for being our
Thanks,
host.
Michelle.
You're welcome. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Keep well. God bless.
You too.
Be well. Stay safe.